He may not be distant simply because he needs space. Sometimes that distance exists because his attention has already moved somewhere else. And before you spend another night wondering what is wrong with you, asking yourself why he becomes cold whenever things start getting serious, wondering why his phone is suddenly always turned over, and why his explanations never completely make sense, you need to look at the pattern differently. The signs may not be about his attachment style at all. They may be about another person. If you have ever cared about someone who made you feel like you were constantly chasing a disappearing shadow, put a ghost emoji in the comments and subscribe, because what you are about to hear is something many people only understand after they have spent far too long blaming themselves. There can be a recognizable pattern when an emotionally avoidant man is secretly investing in another connection. It does not always look like obvious cheating. It can look like emotional distance. It can look like needing personal space. It can look like him simply behaving the way he always behaves. And that is precisely why it can be so difficult to recognize. So let's break it down. The first sign is that he becomes unreachable in ways that always seem reasonable. This is often the first thing you notice and the first thing you convince yourself not to notice. He does not completely disappear. That would make the situation too obvious. Instead, his availability becomes selective. He answers certain messages, but leaves others sitting there. He returns some calls, but ignores others. He remains present just enough that you cannot easily accuse him of abandoning the relationship, yet he becomes distant enough that something inside you starts feeling uncomfortable. And here is what makes it so confusing. He almost always has an explanation ready. He was exhausted. Work became stressful. He had something important to deal with. He needed some time alone. He needed to clear his head. Every individual explanation can sound perfectly believable. That is exactly what makes the pattern so difficult to recognize. It is rarely one enormous warning sign. It is usually dozens of small changes that slowly accumulate until you realize the entire relationship feels different. An emotionally avoidant man who is hiding another connection may not completely vanish. He may simply become dimmer. He gives you enough attention to prevent you from leaving, enough affection to keep hope alive, and enough communication that you continue telling yourself everything is probably fine. Meanwhile, you are left living in the space between what he says and what he actually does. And that space can become emotionally exhausting. You start filling in the missing information yourself. You question your instincts. You wonder whether you are asking for too much. Maybe you are being overly sensitive. Maybe you are becoming needy. Maybe you should simply be more understanding. You begin apologizing for wanting ordinary communication. You make your needs smaller. You become quieter. You try to become easier to love because you think that if you stop asking for so much, he will finally move closer again. But stop and look at what is happening. You are changing yourself to accommodate someone who is giving you less and less. That is not automatically a sign that you are too demanding. It may be a sign that the relationship has become deeply unbalanced. Selective availability can create a powerful emotional dynamic because it keeps another person engaged without offering them the security they need. They receive enough attention to remain hopeful, but never enough consistency to feel settled. And when someone already has a naturally distant personality, that emotional distance can become an especially effective cover for hidden behavior because everyone around them is already accustomed to their privacy. You tell yourself, that is just how he is. You excuse the missed calls. You explain the canceled plans. You give him more room. You wait for him to feel better. You become even more patient. But while you are giving him space, something else may be developing outside the relationship. And perhaps the hardest part is that your instincts may have noticed the change long before your conscious mind was willing to admit it. You felt the difference. You just did not have the words for it. That is what awareness gives you. Not a reason to become paranoid, but a language for recognizing patterns. And you deserve to understand what you are experiencing instead of constantly blaming yourself. The second sign is that he starts protecting his phone as though it contains information he absolutely does not want you to see. Let's be realistic about this. In a secure and transparent relationship, a phone is usually just a phone. It sits on the table. It charges beside the bed. It gets left in another room. Nobody becomes visibly tense when their partner walks near it. There is no constant performance of secrecy because there is nothing important that needs to be hidden. But when someone is managing another emotional connection behind the scenes, their phone can suddenly become highly protected. And it does not always happen dramatically. Sometimes there is no obvious moment where he grabs the phone from your hand or panics when you enter the room. It can develop so gradually that you barely notice the change at first. He begins carrying it everywhere. He takes it with him when he goes to the bathroom. He places it face down whenever you sit beside him. He angles the screen away while typing. He lowers the brightness. He becomes careful about where notifications appear. He may clear messages more frequently. He may suddenly change his password and give you an explanation that sounds reasonable. He might become unusually alert whenever someone contacts him. Again, none of these behaviors automatically proves that another woman exists. A person can have privacy preferences for many legitimate reasons. What matters is the larger pattern. Is the phone behavior happening at the same time as emotional withdrawal? Is it happening alongside canceled plans, unexplained schedule changes, reduced communication, and a growing sense that something is different? That combination deserves your attention. And this is where the situation becomes especially confusing with someone who has always been emotionally guarded. You may have spent months or years learning to respect his privacy. You may have deliberately avoided asking too many questions because you did not want to appear controlling. You may have told yourself that trust means giving someone room. You tried to be the understanding partner. You tried not to invade his personal space. You tried not to become jealous. And those choices may have been made from a healthy place. But if the other person begins using privacy as a shield for secrecy, the situation changes. You cannot be expected to ignore a sudden transformation simply because you once promised to respect their boundaries. Notice what happens inside you when his phone suddenly lights up. Do you feel your stomach tighten? Does your chest become tense? Do you suddenly feel curious but then immediately shame yourself for wondering? That reaction does not automatically prove that something is happening. But it does tell you that your sense of safety has changed. And instead of attacking yourself for having that reaction, ask why you no longer feel secure. Ask whether his behavior has contributed to that feeling. The goal is not to become obsessed with his phone. The goal is to stop ignoring the emotional information created by the entire pattern, because sometimes the most important clue is not what you discover on the screen. It is what you have been feeling in the relationship for weeks before you ever looked at it. You are not supposed to spend every day decoding someone else's behavior just to convince yourself that you deserve honesty. And if you constantly feel like you have to shrink your needs, silence your instincts, and pretend everything is normal simply to keep the relationship peaceful, then something important has already changed. Keep watching, because the next pattern can reveal even more about what happens when emotional distance is no longer just about needing space. You're not imagining everything, and being observant is not the same thing as being paranoid. Those are two very different things. The third sign is that he pulls you close immediately after creating distance. This can be the most confusing pattern because it can also feel incredibly powerful, and it may be one of the reasons you stayed much longer than you ever expected. Think about the cycle. He disappears for a while. His messages become colder. He feels distant. Reaching him becomes difficult. Eventually, you start stepping back too, not because you are trying to manipulate him, but because you are exhausted. You are confused. You are emotionally drained by never knowing which version of him you are going to get. Then, right when you have reached the limit of your patience, something changes. He comes back. Suddenly he is warm again. He pays attention. He sends a good morning message without you asking. He suggests plans. He looks at you with that familiar expression that once made you believe everything was going to be okay. Maybe he says something deeply personal that makes you feel understood again. Something small but specific. Something that reminds you exactly why you became attached to him, and suddenly relief rushes through you. The person you love seems to have returned. But ask yourself a harder question. Did he come back because he truly missed you, or because something changed somewhere else? This is where the pattern becomes important. If another connection exists in his life, his emotional availability may begin shifting depending on what is happening in both relationships. When that other connection feels exciting, comfortable, or satisfying, you may receive very little attention. You become someone he checks in with when convenient. But when tension develops somewhere else, when that person pulls away, demands more, or the excitement starts fading, he may suddenly turn back toward the connection that feels familiar and emotionally safe. And if he knows you are likely to welcome him, that return can become even easier. You may not be his first emotional choice. You may have become the place he returns to when he needs comfort. And that is what makes intermittent affection so powerful. The human brain responds strongly to unpredictable rewards. When warmth appears randomly after long periods of coldness, the warmth can feel incredibly valuable. You wait longer for it. You think about it more. You work harder to get it again. The highs feel enormous because the lows were painful. A simple, loving message can feel like a major emotional event because you have been starving for that connection. But that does not automatically mean the relationship is healthy. Sometimes what feels like extraordinary chemistry is simply an unpredictable cycle of closeness and withdrawal. And if you have been living inside that cycle for months while calling the relationship complicated, pause there. Sometimes complicated is simply the word we use when the truth feels too painful to face. He may not be impossible to understand. He may simply be emotionally divided. And now we come to the fourth sign. He begins describing a life that somehow does not include you. Watch this one closely because it can be extremely subtle. When someone is hiding another part of their life, small pieces of that life can accidentally enter the relationship you have with them. He mentions a restaurant you have never visited together. He talks about a movie you know you never watched with him. He casually refers to an experience that does not fit anywhere in the timeline you understand. Maybe he uses an expression or inside reference that seems strangely familiar to him but completely unfamiliar to you. His weekend stories become vague. Certain details disappear. Some topics suddenly seem easy for him to discuss, while others make him uncomfortable. Sometimes he offers information before you even ask, almost as though he has already prepared an explanation. And when you ask a simple follow-up question, he may avoid giving a direct answer. He might change the subject. He might give you a technically correct response that somehow leaves you even more confused. He may become defensive, or he may simply become vague. None of these behaviors proves that another person exists. That distinction matters. But repeated inconsistencies can still tell you something about the relationship. Maintaining different stories requires more mental effort than simply telling the truth. When someone is managing separate parts of their life, details can occasionally cross over. A name slips out, a routine changes, a familiar place suddenly appears in conversation. An unexplained schedule change becomes normal. One small inconsistency may mean nothing, but several changes happening together deserve attention. And you notice these things because you are emotionally invested. Your conscious mind may keep trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, while another part of you continues registering the pattern. This is where emotional awareness becomes important. You do not have to accuse someone simply because your instincts feel uncomfortable. You also do not have to ignore your instincts until you have courtroom-level evidence. Feelings are not always facts, but feelings can be signals. Your mind constantly notices patterns before you can consciously explain them. Sometimes that uneasy feeling is your brain telling you that the relationship no longer matches what you are being told. So instead of immediately dismissing yourself, become curious. What exactly changed? When did it change? Is it a one-time event or a repeated pattern? Are his words and actions still matching? Those questions can give you much more clarity than endlessly blaming yourself. And now we reach the fifth sign, and this one can leave the deepest emotional damage. He begins making you feel as though your needs are the actual problem. This is the pattern that can stay with you long after the relationship is over. It can make you look back months or even years later and wonder whether something was fundamentally wrong with you. Maybe you were too emotional. Maybe you asked for too much. Maybe you needed too much reassurance. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you somehow made love difficult. But before you accept that story, stop and question who taught you to believe it. Because sometimes the easiest way for someone to avoid taking responsibility for their behavior is to convince you that your perfectly reasonable needs are the problem. And once you start believing that, you stop asking for what you deserve. You begin apologizing for wanting consistency. You become afraid to speak. You monitor your emotions. You lower your expectations. You try to become smaller so the relationship can survive. But love should not require you to disappear in order to keep someone comfortable. And if you have reached this point, stay with me, because understanding this final pattern may completely change the way you interpret everything that happened. When an emotionally avoidant man is secretly involved with another woman, he can face a very particular emotional problem. He needs to deal with your growing discomfort and suspicion without acknowledging what may actually be creating those feelings. He cannot simply tell you the truth, so the conversation can slowly shift away from his behavior and toward your reaction to it. You notice that he has become distant, so you bring it up, hoping for an honest conversation. Instead, somehow, you end up defending why you were concerned in the first place. He tells you that you are too sensitive. He says you always search for problems. He says your lack of trust hurts him. He tells you that too many questions make him feel trapped. He may even say that he needs someone who can give him space without turning every change into a serious discussion. And because you care about him, and because perhaps you have heard before that you can be too emotional or ask for too much, you begin believing the explanation. Avoidant behavior can sometimes be delivered with such calmness and sadness that it does not immediately feel like an attack. So you start changing yourself instead. You monitor every reaction. You think carefully before bringing up something that bothers you. You rewrite your feelings in your head before speaking because you want to make sure they sound reasonable. Certain questions disappear completely. Certain subjects become forbidden because you already know how the conversation will end. Slowly, you become quieter while he becomes more comfortable. Stop and think about what just happened. Your discomfort, which may have been connected to real changes you were noticing, was transformed into a supposed weakness in your personality. Instead of examining the behavior creating the tension, the focus moved toward making you responsible for feeling the tension. This can resemble a pattern known as DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Not every emotionally avoidant person uses this pattern deliberately, and not every defensive response means someone is hiding another relationship. But when this dynamic repeatedly occurs, the impact can be serious. You begin doubting yourself. You question your memory. You question your judgment. Eventually, you may even stop trusting the instincts that were originally trying to tell you something had changed. And that is why this pattern can be so destructive. The greatest damage is not always the secret itself. Sometimes the greater damage is what happens to your confidence in your own perception. Self-trust is one of the foundations of every healthy relationship you will have in the future. Without it, you can walk into another relationship carrying the same doubt, wondering whether your needs are legitimate or whether you should simply remain silent. So if you have spent time in a relationship where your needs were repeatedly treated as inconveniences, hear this clearly. Having needs does not make you too much. Wanting honesty does not make you difficult. Wanting consistency does not make you needy. And noticing repeated changes does not automatically make you paranoid. Sometimes awareness simply becomes uncomfortable for someone who would rather keep the situation unclear. Now let's bring all of these patterns together, because recognizing individual behaviors only becomes useful when you understand how they connect. Selective unavailability, increased phone secrecy, sudden cycles of warmth followed by withdrawal, stories and routines that seem disconnected from the life you know, and finally, your needs being turned into supposed character flaws. When these behaviors repeatedly appear together, they can create an environment where you are constantly off balance. You question yourself before questioning what is happening around you. You spend more time trying to prove that you are worthy of attention than asking whether the relationship is actually meeting your basic emotional needs. You work harder and harder for something that should not require constant effort just to exist. Healthy love should not require you to become smaller. It should not punish you for noticing changes. It should not make you feel unstable simply because you want clarity. Real connection allows two people to talk about discomfort without turning one person into the problem. But there is another part of this story that deserves attention, and it is the emotional aftermath. Because recognizing an unhealthy pattern and actually walking away from it are two completely different challenges. You can understand everything intellectually and still feel emotionally attached. You can know something is hurting you and still miss the person. You can recognize the cycle and still hope the next version of the relationship will finally be different. That does not mean you are weak. It does not mean you lacked intelligence. There is a psychological reason these cycles can become so difficult to leave. Intermittent reinforcement can make unpredictable affection especially powerful. When warmth appears after long periods of distance, your brain can become intensely focused on getting that warmth again. The rare good moments begin carrying enormous emotional weight. You remember the nights when he was affectionate. You remember the conversations when he made you feel completely understood. You remember the moments when he looked at you as though you were the only person who mattered. Those moments felt real. Your emotions were real. The connection you experienced was real to you, and that is exactly why letting go can hurt so much. You are not only grieving the person, you may also be grieving the version of the relationship you kept hoping would return permanently. You may be grieving the future you imagined. You may be grieving the possibility that things could have become what you wanted if only he had stayed consistent. But here is the part you need to hold on to. The love you felt was never the problem. Loving someone does not make you foolish. Caring deeply does not make you weak. The problem begins when love becomes the reason you repeatedly abandon yourself. You can honor what you felt without continuing to accept what hurts you. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop trying to convince someone to give you the consistency they have already shown they are unwilling or unable to provide. Your ability to love deeply, to recognize someone's potential, and to remain patient during difficult moments were never the things that failed you. Those qualities are valuable. They can create something incredibly meaningful when they are given to someone who knows how to receive them and return them. The problem was never that you loved too much. The problem was where that love was being invested. And that is something you have the power to change. It begins with becoming completely honest with yourself about what you have been accepting and why you kept accepting it. It means sitting with the discomfort of uncertainty instead of automatically reaching for the familiar pain of someone who keeps you close enough to maintain hope, but distant enough to keep you confused. It means rebuilding the trust in yourself that may have slowly weakened during a relationship where you were constantly encouraged, directly or indirectly, to question your own feelings and perceptions. That kind of emotional rebuilding takes time. It does not happen in one afternoon, but it begins with one important decision: seeing the pattern clearly, not calling it a relationship that is almost healthy, not describing someone as a person who almost shows up, not convincing yourself that the connection is almost what you need. Look at the entire system instead. Ask whether the pattern has kept you available, kept you uncertain, and kept you focused on proving yourself rather than asking the questions that actually matter. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was not. Either way, the effect on you is what matters now. You have seen the pattern. That means you can finally begin asking different questions.